Hi everyone, and welcome to our second episode of the Connecting Us podcast for 2021. My name is Richard and I work in the Connecting Us editorial team. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land on which we are recording today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Data literacy is increasingly becoming an important skill for any role in the APS. Therefore, in today's episode, we're getting to know one of our data gurus who will share with us his reflections on working on some complex projects involving data at the APS. Joining us today is Duncan Young from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Duncan is General Manager, National Data Acquisition Division. Duncan has been in leadership roles for nearly 20 years at the ABS and Statistics New Zealand. He was recognised as the 2011 Australian Government Young ICT Professional of the Year and completed a Masters of Public Administration in 2012. Duncan, welcome to the podcast and thanks for making the time to speak with us today.
It's a real pleasure, Richard. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. And I understand, well, obviously you're speaking to us from Hobart today. How's the weather and how is it working down in Hobart?
The sun's out. It's always sunny here in Hobart.
I know that's
well,
a lie.
Not really, but firstly, I'd like to acknowledge as well the traditional owners down here. It's the Palawa people, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I grew up down here in Hobart, and my family, we trace back 203 years in Hobart. So my children are 10th generation Hobartians, which, as a bit of a side, it's always quite humbling to think about the Palawa people with 1,000+ generations here. But certainly I feel really connected to place down here in Hobart. And I did start my career with the ABS here as a graduate, and I'm the second eldest of 10 children, and so my family was quite young at that stage, and so I really wanted to stay close to family. But and so location probably chose my pathway, but I'm just so incredibly fortunate to have chosen the ABS. And so I have left the island. I have been to the mainland, and I did spend a few years in New Zealand with Statistics New Zealand, and then about 10 years in Canberra. And I've had a few moves back to Hobart, and I came back to Hobart as an EL2 and was inconveniently promoted back to an SES in Canberra, so I came back up to Canberra, and then I came back to Hobart 3 years ago, and so I'm very grateful to the ABS and to the APS that we can now do quite senior jobs from a lot of different locations.
So unlike most people in the APS, it sounds like you're pretty familiar with remote working. How's that been for you, and what have been your key kind of lessons to make it work?
Yeah, so probably from day one for me, I've always been part of virtual teams, whether it's been my boss or my colleagues or my staff being in other locations. I was the only graduate in my Hobart office that year, and so it's probably helped me be a little bit more proactive about the way that I reach out to people, I build connections, make sure that I have a voice in conversations. But COVID has really been a bit of a game changer on top of that. It's really sort of challenged the ways that we think about what can be done virtually or how things are done. And what I've really noticed through this period is more of it's not just what's possible, but actually that there's a whole lot of things actually work better now through our use of virtual technologies. As a little example, I'm involved with meetings with people from other government agencies, and often people wouldn't be able to make those meetings because they fit it in with a travel across town, parking, the time taken. And so I reckon you get more often you get the A team in there rather than delegates, and people can more efficiently move from one thing to another. But I do love catching up in person to have a beer or a coffee. But so I miss that a little bit. But we've given a fair crack to virtual drinks or real drinks over virtual connections, and they're worth trying. You just have to be a bit more conscious about how to make sure everyone's included.
Yeah, that's right. So you've spent the bulk of your career with the ABS. What's kept you working with the one agency?
One of the things I've learned, I guess, is that working in one agency doesn't mean working in one job. So along the way, I've kept finding new roles, and each new role has taught me something new, and it's opened a new door for something different. And so I started in IT, so as an ICT graduate, and I moved into sort of technical leadership roles, then into staff management roles, and then into sort of project management, and then into an executive role, and then into business program management, and then into transformation. So it's kept being sort of changing roles over time. So it's felt like, a lot of different jobs, despite it being one organisation. And I've been really lucky with the ABSS in terms of ABS is really internationally connected. We need to produce statistics which are comparable around the world, and we can learn data best practice. And so I've done work on censuses in Myanmar, Vietnam, Indonesia, the UK, and with the UN Stats Division in New York. So lots of different experiences along the way. But what I've found is that each role I've taken on does give you something new, and I'm always thinking about, will this role help me find another role that I find interesting and challenging? What will I learn from this? And so that's it's not to say that this is a pathway for everyone. I don't think there's one right path. I think there's many different paths, and underpinning all of that, and it'd be fair to say that I do love the ABS there, so I've always felt a debt of gratitude to the ABS for their support of me, and always feel like I'm trying to pay that back a bit. So I've always been happy to take on new roles and they've come along. But maybe a different agency in the future.
Yeah, nice plug for the ABS there, which is important. It certainly doesn't sound like you've been sitting still, even though you've stayed in the one agency, always moving around to different and exciting projects. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about some of the bigger projects you've been involved in over your career.
Yeah, it's hard to go past the 2016 Census of Population and Housing. So we say this is the largest peacetime logistical exercise in Australia. And so put that into context, as National Program Manager, I was responsible for over 40,000 staff. They travelled the distance equivalent to 190 times around the equator of the Earth in order to make sure we counted Australia's 24 million people across their 10 million homes, and ultimately produced 3 trillion cells of data and published 20 million tables of data. So it was an interesting undertaking for sure. And the 2016 census was a bit of a start of a new era for census taking in Australia. It was our move to a digital-first, data-driven approach. And it ultimately led to some significant savings, and I think 327,000 kilograms less paper used. Wow. That's about 220 family sedans, if you like to count your paper in sedans. But whilst the 2016 census delivered some great benefits and ultimately delivered really great data, it'll be remembered by most people as being a census which asked all Australians to go online on August 9, and then and they did, and sadly later that night he suffered an attack, and we took down the website for a period of time. And so one of my inglorious claims to fame is a global trending hashtag of census fail, and it was a really challenging kind of moment. We considered a slogan of try again on August 10, but it was still down that day. So thank heavens it worked on August 11, and the form came back up. And whilst ultimately we delivered a successful census in terms of the data, we definitely want to do better in the future.
From a personal perspective, I'd be curious to know how you personally dealt with the stress and I guess the pressure during that time, and how you kind of picked yourself back up and kept moving.
good question. It's one which people ask me a bit, Richard. What I'd say is that Census 2016 was a bit of a crucible moment for both the ABS and myself. It's an experience which, interestingly, I wouldn't recommend to anyone, but it was probably the best thing that ever happened to me. So, I think that at the time, we really focused on, well, what are we here for, and what are we trying to achieve, Eve? And so how do we spend some time with the staff around us? How do we come together and be open about the fact that it's tough, and that we're having hard days, and we can be embarrassed, we can be sad, we can be angry, and be open about those kinds of feelings and expressions. And it probably led to quite honest interpersonal conversations, and that really sort of supported the team. And then just keep focusing on, we've got a real clear job here to do and to deliver, and that sort of binds you together. But then afterwards, I think the reflecting back on the experience, both individually and as an organisation, around how do we learn from this experience, and how do we make sure that good comes of that helps us for the future.
So you delivered a successful census in 2016 despite all those challenges and obstacles. What was next? Where do you go to after something so crucible?
I sort of secretly hope probably to slide into a quiet back office somewhere in ABS Belconnen, and maybe have a nice spreadsheet to play with. But it wasn't to be. Exactly 1 year on to the day from census night, a Sydney tabloids headline that I'll never forget is "Census bunglers from hopeless bureau statistics to run plebiscite." So the ABS was directed to undertake the Australian Marriage Law Survey, and I was back in the front line again as a program manager. And I'll talk a bit about the survey, but before I sort of talk about the survey, I want to pause and acknowledge the survey period was really tough, a really hard time for a number of members of our community, and I certainly don't want to make light of that, and I certainly, ought to sound celebratory about the survey per se, but it's part of the context of when the survey was run and how the survey was perceived in the community. And as a public servant, it was one of those moments where you really do think about your own role, and our role was quite clear that it was to deliver the best possible survey for Australia that we could, and one that's trusted, inclusive, respectful, and so that's what we went and about, and that's what I'm sort of pleased of in that space. So, what was the marriage law survey like to work on? Unlike the 7-year census, we had 99 days for the marriage law survey. An advertising campaign was developed and launched on air in 36 hours. We're engaging with stakeholders on day one, and really doing co-design. And we had no choices. We had High Court challenges. We had a Senate inquiry. We designed, produced, and distributed 64 million items in a month to get the survey underway. It was really crazy. But ultimately, we felt that we did do a really good job of it, and the census lessons were really important for that, and the fact that we'd sort of reflected on that. So some of the key lessons I think that we took from the census was a really understanding of paramount importance of public trust. Like public trust, it's really the fuel that sort of feeds into any of our kind of public programs. Also, the real focus on partnerships, and the fact that in today's complex world, we're all better when we're working together, and if we can bring together the best expertise, whether it's in service delivery and call centres from Services Australia, or whether it's in some of the policy and legislation and elements from central government and bringing those things together. But also some of the positive lessons too. The census recovery was on the back of people which have been built as a really close collaborative team who stood together, and so really focusing a marriage law survey on bringing people together, a really dynamic task force which had representatives of 13 agencies and about 100 staff that met twice daily in stand-ups to really sort of make sure that we're all together on this. And so but ultimately the results were delivered on time, and they demonstrated a clear public view, and it led to legislation changes incredibly quickly afterwards.
Yeah. It's time to come clean about my stereotypes. Before talking to you, I thought people working in data roles, it's pretty dry, unemotional work, but the picture you're painting for us this morning couldn't be further from the truth, and I guess that's because people care about their work, and the data and the results matter. They have implications, and not just doing it because it's something interesting to do, but has implications for policy within Australia.
Yeah, no, thanks, Richard. I think that's absolutely the case. Whilst I joke sometimes that if you're at a barbecue and you're not feeling like a conversation, tell someone you work at the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and it can be end a conversation pretty quickly, and they ask you what you like doing on the weekends. So perfect cover story to hide up a real occupation. But if you do find a statistician, get them talking about their work, and they'll love to tell you about it, and they'll have the same passion about its value to the community.
Maybe we can catch up at a barbecue down the track.
Sounds great.
So 2021, obviously COVID is still ever present in our lives, but the work of government doesn't stop. And I understand 2021's another census year. I know that because I was one of the lucky few that got a letter in the mail last year asking me to complete a test for the census. So could you tell us a little bit about how preparations are going for this year's census?
180 sleeps to go as of the day we're recording today. So it's not that we're counting or anything, but it's we're really working hard on delivering a really great census for all Australians. And this year, but there's some changes to the census this year, which are really exciting thing, I think. We're asking a couple of new questions. We haven't had new questions in the census for a while. So there's a question on long-term health conditions. So to people's experience, have they been diagnosed with heart disease or arthritis or diabetes or a few others? And so that's going to give us some really amazing insights into these conditions across society and help with our health planning. There's also questions around service in the Australian Defence Force to help us better understand current and former service people in the country. So that's sort of exciting, but a lot of our focus for this year has been how do we make sure that the census runs smoothly and provides a great experience for all Australians. And so Australians ultimately, the majority of Australians responded online last time, so there's a community expectation there for a really easy, good digital channel, and so that certainly will be in place, and we're working with a completely new system that's taken on all of the feedback from the reviews from 2016, all of our own reflections from that, it being independently reviewed and working with government security agencies, but also working on all of the other methods to support people, so people can still fill the census out on paper if that's their preference, or to a channel which they need, as well as all of the other strategies to make sure that it does truly count every single person in the country.
I mentioned up front that data literacy is becoming an increasingly valued skill in the APS. What would you say to the people who run screaming from a spreadsheet? How can they get more comfortable with working with and understanding data?
I find it hard to imagine running screaming from a spreadsheet.
I've seen it.
I love data. I love numbers, and probably nearly as much as I love people. They're right up there. But so do those people. I guess like people with data, you do need to invest some time to get to know the data. Like it's not all first date kind of stuff. You want to really invest at getting to know your data, and so data I think of as a bit of a shorthand representation of a world. Like one of our sort of first memories of data, or numbers that people see sometimes as childhood paint by numbers, like you colour in all the number fives green and stuff, and that's sort of the way numbers work. They can represent the world in really simple ways that people can understand. But yeah, when you're looking at data, a few sort of techniques that I like to use, and you've probably heard a few of them in the conversation today. Numbers are really hard if you can't compare it to something that you know. And so I mentioned earlier that I had 40,000 staff in the Census program. It's just so hard to get your head around a number like that. I went along to Dockland Stadium in Melbourne to watch my beloved Essendon Bombers play. They probably lost, but one of the things I took away was it's about 40,000 sitting in the stadium that day, and just looking around the stadium going, wow, that's I've got a responsibility to keep these people safe, to look after them, to provide clarity of information, and so it really helps. So having a few numbers in your mind that you can compare things against. So it was 100,000 people sitting in the MCG, it's 400,000 people in Canberra, 40,000 kilometres around the equator of the world, 4 million metres or 4 million steps from Sydney to Perth, 85,000 seconds in a day. So I just have a few of those numbers sort of in my head, which if I need to sort of try and explain something, or to even just reason it out myself, it's really useful, or to have some reference points. The other one, my grandfather, my late grandfather, who was a carpenter, he was a really his kind of view was you should be able to estimate anything, and so he said that the way he estimates things is he thinks of a number that is clearly too big, and then he thinks of a number which is clearly too big, and then you know the answer somewhere in between. And if you start at a midpoint, there's worse places to start. Doesn't always work, but it gives you a start. So final advice on numbers is ask someone who likes numbers to help and to sit down with you. There are people like me out there who just love talking about numbers and helping share the interest in numbers, and so I'm sure you'll find many willing people who will happily work through a beautiful chart with you, or a lovely graph.
So I think you've already touched on this a little bit during our conversation this morning, but what do you love most about working in the APS?
It's a pretty simple one. I think we do really important things, and we do them with quite amazing people, and I really like the combination we have of, I think that we're incredibly progressive and innovative in a number of our approaches and ways of doing things, but there's also a real respect for the past and an ability to learn from the past. And so as I mentioned right off the top, I didn't nobly start in the public service due to a great desire to serve the public. I was just trying to earn some money and live close to my family. But over the last 20 years, there's certainly a love for the institution that we get to be part of has really grown.
Absolutely. Well, Duncan, I think we've come to our end point in the conversation today. It's been so valuable to learn more about those really challenging experiences in your career, the most exciting bits, and how you've kind of demonstrated leadership within the ABS and within the APS more broadly. So I really wanted to thank you for taking the time to share your story with us this morning, and I want to thank all our listeners for taking the time to share Duncan's story with us this morning as well. So don't forget to check out our latest edition of Connecting Us, which is all about data in this edition, and you can keep listening to us for more stories about your APS colleagues through the Connecting Us podcast. So thanks, Duncan.
Thanks, Richard. It's a pleasure.
Today's show was written and presented by Richard Ziolkowski with editorial input from Indrani Sen. Matthew Bully did the sound editing, original music by Ed Rading. Special thanks to Duncan Young, General Manager for the National Data Acquisition Division at the Australian Bureau of Statistics, for sharing his story with us. Thanks for listening. We look forward to sharing more APS stories like this one with you through Connecting Us.